A German shepherd appears at a rain-soaked bus stop, alert and determined, guiding a frightened little girl and her tiny puppy through the shadows of danger. With every cautious step, the loyal dog senses threats no one else can see, standing as a silent guardian between fear and safety. But what secrets lie behind the walls of her home, and how far will this courageous companion go to protect her watch? As one dog's instinct leads to discoveries that could change everything. And you won't believe what comes next. The little girl had folded herself into the shape of pain. A small knot on the splintered bench beneath the fogged plexiglass of the bus shelter, rain threading down her hair in thin silver lines. Backpack pressed to her ribs like a shield that trembled, and when she finally found her voice, it barely rose above the hiss of water on asphalt. "Please don't take me home. It hurts too much." A whisper that seemed to shiver the air the way cold does. A whisper that steadied the puppy hidden inside the bag and set him whining a soft, pleading note. A heartbeat of sound from something fragile, fighting to be brave. The street was empty at that hour, the wet light slow and pale. The world narrowed to breath and ache and the warmth of a small animal pressed against a child's stomach. Her hands shook where they gripped the frayed strapped knuckles bright as bone. And she drew in air like the rain might carry medicine if she tried hard enough, like the cold could rinse the burning under her skin. A blur of amber moved at the edge of the shelter, low and deliberate, a powerful shepherd with rain streaming from his flanks. The coat a warm golden brown with sable ripples that darkened as water soaked the guard hairs. Ears, pricked eyes lit with that alert, steady intelligence that reads sorrow as clearly as scent. He lowered himself so his face arrived level with hers, nostrils flaring, breath fogging the glass, and in that silent pause between dog and child, the space around the bench changed the way a room changes when someone who knows how to hold fear walks in, not with words, only with presence. The puppy inside the backpack answered with a hopeful chirp. The girl loosened her grip enough to slide 2 fingers through the zipper, and a damp nose found her thumb, hot and real and alive. She closed her eyes. "Rusty," she whispered, and the shepherd, larger, older, a veteran of long nights and hard searches, flicked a glance toward the sound of boots on wet concrete. Ethan Ward came out of the rain with the quiet that soldiers carry after they have learned to move without stirring the world. More than necessary, the hood of his patrol jacket slick with water. His gaze already reading the angles, the tilt of the bench, the way the girl held her middle, the lavender gray. Of her lips from chill, the dog's protective posture. The backpack packed too tight for toys, details that snap into a pattern before a name arrives. He crouched and set his hand open on the ground, palm up, a position that told her he would not rush her, that he had time and warmth and a willingness to wait. "My name is Ethan," he said, voice pitched to the hush of rain, "and this is Shadow." He nodded toward the shepherd with the amber coat, who never took his eyes off the girl, who lowered his chest to the concrete like a patient barrier against any wind the morning might invent. The girl's lashes clung with drops. She watched the big dog, then the man, then the dog again, as if they were 2 shores of a narrow river she had to cross. Lila, she managed, and the name brought with it a tiny rush of breath, as though speaking it let some space open between the pain and the person inside it. "Hi, Lila." Ethan's smile reached his eyes. "Is Rusty in the bag?" She nodded, a quick flinch of movement, and eased the zipper down 3 inches. A wedge of warm, wet fur pressed through. The puppy's coat carried the same golden undertone as the shepherd, a softer amber, still finding its adult shade, the ears too big for his head, the gaze both anxious and eager, as if the weight of the world and a field of butterflies lived in the same little heart. He licked Lila's fingers, then peered up at Shadow, who breathed one deep, slow greeting that sent reassurance into the tiny space like heat from a stove. "Good morning," Rusty Ethan said, because speaking to a puppy through a child's fear often feels like speaking to the child's hope. "You've been very brave." Shadow shifted, laying his chin on the toe of Ethan's boot, the signal he used when he had already decided the stranger was his responsibility. The rain clicked against the roof of the shelter, soft and endless. A bus huffed far down the road and veered away. Somewhere a raven spoke to no one in particular. Lila Ethan continued, "I want to help warm you up and find out what's hurting. Would it be okay if we got you and Rusty into a dry seat with a blanket and Shadow rides beside you?" He glanced at the shepherd, who offered the dignified patience of a monk in a fur coat. "He's very good at sharing seats." She swallowed. The hand on her stomach tightened and then relaxed. He watched the moment pain traveled across her face. Lower right quadrant, a protective curl of shoulder, a sharp inhalation that suggested the ache had grown familiar in the last days. Not a sudden terror. The observation lodged in him like a pin marking a map. "I can carry the bag," he said, soft as rain, and then he added the thing that mattered most, because children listen for it more carefully than adults do. "I will listen to you all the way, and Shadow will stay exactly where you can touch him." She looked at Shadow, at the amber coat gone darker with water, at the steady focus that made him feel like a wall that also breathed, and her chin trembled once as if it had been holding itself still for a week. "Okay," she whispered. The morning had begun long before those words, the patrol a ribbon of habit that wound from the river road through the old mill blocks and up past the cedar ridge where fog kept its own counsel. Ethan had woken before the alarm, the way you do when you've carried the same schedule enough times that your bones set it for you. And the house had greeted him with coffee, already rising in the machine, and Shadow pacing his small circle by the door. Nails ticking on hardwood in a rhythm that said the day had arrived, and whatever it held, they would meet it together. The jacket had felt familiar on his shoulders. The radio had crackled with the thin chatter of a town that slept hard and woke slow. He had told himself he liked the rain, because it kept the streets honest, because it made people move deliberately, because it washed away the glitter that can make a night look kinder than it is. Shadow had leaned into the small space between seats the way he always did when the windshield framed the world as a long gray alley. He loved the window half open so he could drink the story of the town with his nose, who baked bread at 4 a.m., which cat ruled the alley by the fish shack, where a deer had skipped the fence and left a damp track of musk. Ethan spoke to him now and then, because a man speaking to a dog in the early hours sounds less like talking to an animal and more like measuring your own thoughts out loud. They had run the Willow Creek Loop and the old hardware strip where empty display windows held dusty promises from winters 15 years gone. And then they had turned toward the bus shelter, because habit steers feet better than maps. The switch came in a breath. Shadow's head tilted. The soft whine leaked out before the bark, a sound Ethan had learned was the shepherd's way of saying, "I smell distress," before he said, "I will go find it." Ethan's hand had hovered above the radio and then reconsidered, because this was a dog's minute first. He eased the cruiser to the curb where runoff made a shallow river around the grate, and as he opened the door, a thin blade of cold air cut across his jaw, sharp with wet concrete, and something else metal and solvent, and the faint sour tang of old paint. Memory rose behind his ribs like a film of static. Shadow launched to the ground with purpose rather than excitement, which always meant he already knew what he was looking for. His body narrowed, head down, tail level, the posture of a living compass. The first sight of Lila had struck Ethan with a mixture of recognition and fury. He didn't show his face, the recognition of a kind of curl that children learn when they have been pulling pain around themselves for days. The fury reserved for whatever world allows that posture to become a habit. He approached as he had been trained to in a dozen academies and a dozen moments that never made it into reports, voice calm, hands visible, attention divided between the child's eyes and the dog's. Read of her fear, because dogs tell the truth about people faster than people do. Now, with the choice made and the morning narrowing to actions, he shrugged out of his patrol jacket and swung it around Lila's shoulders, tucking the edges as though he had wrapped a niece after a swimming lesson. The lining radiated stored warmth. Shadow slid forward until the weight of his shoulder pressed lightly to the girl's shin, and he could feel the tremor in her calves ease. Rusty's head popped out farther, and Ethan saw the way the puppy's tiny tongue tried to lick comfort into the air, while his front paws paddled against the zipper. "We'll make a spot for you too," Ethan promised him, and Rusty cocked his head, like puppies do when they decide they understand English better than people. "Is your belly hurting now or only when you move?" Ethan asked. "Now," Lila said, voice tight. "And when I breathe deep, okay." He let the words sit like a hand on a shoulder. "Short breaths, then. We'll keep them smooth and quiet." Ethan stood with the careful grace of someone carrying a full glass. He lifted the backpack by the top handle and felt more than the soft bounce of an apple and a crayon tin. The bag had a solid weight that spoke of little metal cylinders of a wrong sort of cargo for a child. And his mind set that detail on the same mental map as the solvent smell and the dull flush on the child's skin. He would write it down later, but for now the map lived behind his eyes. "Shadow," he murmured, and the shepherd flowed out of the shelter in a quiet escort body, half turned toward the girl, as if he could block rain with his presence alone. Lila stood swayed, set her palm on Shadow's shoulders, felt the engine of him steady, warm a thrum of life that hummed, "I am here." Her knees decided to believe him. They made the slow 20 steps to the curb together, Ethan keeping pace like a metronome for courage, Lila balancing on the rhythm of dog and man and the small heartbeat in the bag. Rusty kept up a commentary of small size that made something inside Ethan's chest loosen. At the curb, he paused, scanning the block the way training and habit insisted, windows, corners, any sudden change that might turn a quiet extraction into something loud. Cedar Hollow at dawn wears its secrets like mist. Nothing moved except the water. He opened the rear door and set a fleece blanket across the seat, tucking one end up the backrest to make a pocket. "Shadow up," he said, and the shepherd leapt into the car and curled to leave a Lila-sized space against his rib's tail, thumping once, like an invitation. Ethan helped Lila pivot and sit, then eased the backpack into the curve of her knees. Rusty squirmed out enough to plant his paws on Shadow's shoulder, as if the old dog were a raft in a bright, frightening river. Shadow blinked with the infinite tolerance of elder brothers. The heater came on with a low rush. Warmth began to gather in the cab, a thin fog forming on the glass as breath and rain negotiated. Lila tucked her face into Shadow's neck, and Ethan watched the small muscles in her jaw settle. "You did very well," he said. "Both of you." He reached for the radio, thumbed it once, sent the simple message he knew the dispatcher would code as routine welfare to start, and urgent pediatric transport to finish. Then he lifted his eyes to the rear view and found Lila's gaze where it had slid to his, the look children give a stranger who has stepped into the space where a protector should already be standing. "Do you know why it hurts?" she asked, surprise in the question, as if the grown-up talking gently might also carry answers. "I know your body is telling us it needs attention," he replied. "And I know a doctor who is very good at listening to bellies. I'll take you to her. Her name is Dr. Khan. Nurse Claire is there in the morning, too. They have warm rooms and cocoa." "Will you stay?" The words came out in a rush so fast she might not have planned them. "Yes," he said with the clean, certain tone you use when the only honorable choice is yes. "And Shadow will stay unless you want him to take a walk and come right back. He's better behaved in hospitals than most of my friends." She almost smiled, a flicker quick and thin, but still a smile. Rusty's nose made a wet dot on Shadow's ear. The big dog sighed, satisfied with the geometry of his pack. Ethan slid into the driver's seat and set his hands on the wheel, letting the engine idle while he listened to the breathing of the car-child dog, puppy man, and measured it against the rain. He found his mind drifting to all the early mornings that had looked like this without the final human urgency. And then he brought it back the way you bring your attention to a point of light in meditation, because attention is sometimes the only medicine you have. He thought of Cedar Hollow's old mill of the freight lot, where solvents sometimes leaked of houses, where windows stayed shut too long of the way. A child's skin can advertise a story, even when the child can't. He did not make promises he couldn't guarantee. He did not speak her father's name. He kept the moment small and manageable, a series of steps that began with warmth and continued with answers. Behind him, Shadow shifted, fractionally nudging Lila's wrist with his nose until her hand found the groove behind his ear. The girl's eyes slid closed. The puppy settled, tiny chest ticking fast, and then slower, the way little bodies do when they have located the center of a circle. Rusty's collar tag tapped against a zipper tooth, a tinny metronome. Ethan looked out through rain that made the streetlights into stars with long tails. And he thought how compassion sometimes lives in the practical, a blanket in a cold car. A dog taught to lie still when a child leans a cup of cocoa, waiting under fluorescent lights that hum. He eased the cruiser from the curb. The tires parted water with a soft hiss. The town rolled by in gray panels, hardware store gone to ghosts. The bakery with the morning crew moving like shadows behind steamed glass. A church with a porch light that burned through every night out of habit more than faith. He took a slow right, then another, the route he knew would keep the ride as smooth as possible. And he kept talking now and then, the simple patter that keeps fear from growing claws. The names of dogs he and Shadow had met on patrol. The story of how Shadow learned to open the refrigerator one summer and had a long conversation with a rotisserie chicken. The silly things that live beside hard things without asking permission. Lila's face softened against fur. Rusty dream-kicked once, chasing a memory of a yard he deserved. The hospital's canopy rose out of the mist like the mouth of a cave painted in light. Ethan pulled beneath it and let the windshield fill with reflected brightness. He turned in his seat. "We're here," he said. "Warm blankets, skilled listeners, and I will carry the whole world if that's what it takes to keep you steady from this door to the next room." The words felt like a vow rather than a script. Shadow stood careful to keep Lila's hand with him, and the puppy popped his head and chirped at the sudden change in light. Ethan stepped into the rain again, and for a second he closed his eyes, letting water touch his face as if it could rinse the frustration that always rose with the sight of a child wrapped around pain. Then he opened the rear door, lifted the backpack with the gentleness of someone moving treasure, offered his arm, and watched Lila rise in small stages, each one measured by Shadow's position, by Rusty's tiny encouragement, by the promise he had put in the air and refused to withdraw. The automatic doors sighed open like a secret finally told. Somewhere inside, a nurse's shoes tapped a bright rhythm. Somewhere deeper, a doctor checked a chart and set down a pen. The corridor smelled like disinfectant and warm cotton. As they crossed the threshold, Ethan caught their reflections in the glass. Man, child, elder dog, puppy, and thought how sometimes a family is a moment assembled against the weather. He did not know yet exactly where the pain had begun, or what chemicals might have carved their signature into a small body. Though the scent on the backpack and the weight inside it had already written a prologue, and the map in his head had started stitching lines between a bus shelter and a warehouse, and a single name that would require care to speak. He only knew the next right step, and the next, the way you know where to put your foot on a wet path under cedars when the light is thin and you can hear water tell you which stones are slick. "Short breaths," he murmured, and Lila matched him, slow inhale, slow exhale, a duet of steadiness. Shadow's tail brushed her leg like a metronome. Rusty peeped once and then tucked in close, as if he understood that quiet is sometimes louder than shouting. The doors closed behind them, rain drawing its long, patient lines on the glass, and the chapter of this morning turned its page with the soft click of a chart being lifted from a hook. The triage room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm cotton, the kind of clean that clung to a hospital, even in the quiet hours of the morning. Fluorescent light fell in softened squares through a frosted panel above, catching the slow drip of rain still sliding down the glass doors in the hallway. Lila sat small and hunched on the edge of the padded exam table, Ethan's patrol jacket still draped over her like a tent. Beneath its folds, Shadow pressed one amber-furred flank against her knee while Rusty balanced in the crook of her arm, his damp puppy fur puffing with every nervous breath. Nurse Claire Bennett moved like someone who had learned that speed and gentleness could coexist. Her dark hair was pinned back in a neat twist, though a few curls had already broken free under the humidity. She knelt so her eyes were level with Lila's. "Sweetheart, my name's Claire," she said, voice warm and steady, "and I'm just going to check your temperature and listen to your heart. Nothing here will hurt." Lila's fingers tightened briefly on Rusty's scruff, and the puppy made a small squeak, not distressed, just acknowledging the shift in attention. Shadow's gaze tracked every movement, his ears flicking when Claire slid a thermometer from its sterile sleeve. Ethan stood nearby, hands resting loosely on his duty belt, careful not to look like he was guarding so much as present. "Is it okay if I move the jacket for just a second?" Claire asked. Lila hesitated, then gave the tiniest nod. Claire folded the jacket back from her shoulder, and the first pale bruise revealed itself, fingertip-sized marks in fading shades of violet and yellow, scattered like a cruel constellation along the upper arm. Claire's eyes softened, but her expression stayed neutral for Lila's sake. "You've been carrying some hurts for a while, haven't you?" she said gently, and the girl's gaze dropped to Shadow's paws. The thermometer beeped quietly. A little low, Claire murmured, noting the reading. "We'll get you warm." She lifted her stethoscope next. Big breath in and out. "Good. Again for me." Dr. Aisha Khan entered with the kind of presence that eased tension simply by existing. Petite in navy scrubs with an intelligent calm. In her dark eyes, she greeted Ethan with a nod and knelt beside Claire. "Hi, Lila. I'm Dr. Khan. Claire's told me a bit, but I'd like to see for myself how you're feeling." She didn't reach for the girl right away, just sat within arm's length, letting Rusty's wet nose sniff at her fingers and giving Shadow an acknowledging glance. "I see you've got quite the team here," Dr. Khan said. "They're looking after you well." Lila's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile as Rusty burrowed closer under her chin. "Would it be all right if I take a quick look under your sweater, Dr. Khan?" Dr. Khan asked. "We'll stop if you want." After a pause, Lila nodded again. Claire helped ease the damp hoodie upward, revealing the hem of an oversized t-shirt clinging to her ribs. Dr. Khan lifted the fabric just enough to see her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight-darkened bruises along the lower rib cage, a mottled swelling just below the right side, and faint red patches around the skin's surface. "These aren't from a fall," Dr. Khan murmured to Claire, too quiet for Lila to hear. "And this rash, non-bacterial pattern could be irritant contact dermatitis." Ethan caught the words and felt his stomach tighten. Dr. Khan shifted her tone back to gentle brightness. "You've been very brave, Lila. I'd like to run a few tests and ultrasound for your tummy, maybe some blood work. We'll make sure Rusty and Shadow can stay with you while we do it. Would that help?" Lila's eyes lifted to Ethan as if to confirm. He gave a small nod. "I'll be right here," he said. "And Shadow doesn't leave unless you tell him to." Something eased in her posture. While Claire prepared supplies, Ethan stepped closer to the table, pretending to check the patrol jacket as he adjusted it back over Lila's shoulders. He caught it again, that thin, acrid edge beneath the damp wool and rain. Solvent. Old paint thinner. It wasn't the casual whiff from someone who'd walked past a construction site. It was embedded, clinging to fabric fibers, faint but persistent. His eyes went to the faded pink backpack resting against the wall. Water dripped from one strap onto the linoleum. The bag was bulky in a way that didn't match a child's school kit, too heavy, too solid. He remembered the weight when he'd carried it from the bus shelter, the faint clunk of something rigid inside. He glanced at Shadow, who had also noticed the bag, his nostrils flaring. The shepherd looked up at Ethan, then back at the bag. the subtle tell he gave when a scent struck him as familiar from a past search. Dr. Khan had moved to the counter, filling in a chart. Claire was taking Lila's blood pressure, chatting about how puppies sometimes chew socks. Rusty yawned hugely, the tension making him drowsy in the warmth. Ethan bent to Shadow, scratching lightly behind his ear as if the conversation were private. "You're catching it too, aren't you?" he murmured. Shadow's tail swept once against the floor. Dr. Khan's voice brought him back. She gestured him toward the hallway. They stepped outside the triage room, where the ambient noise of the ER hummed distant voices, the beep of monitors. "Her injuries are in various stages of healing," Dr. Khan said quietly. "Some are older than a week, some fresher. The abdominal tenderness is worrying. And the rash, my first thought, is chronic chemical exposure. We'll confirm with labs, but I'd bet on it." Ethan felt the conclusion settling like lead. "You think it's environmental?" "At home or somewhere she spends significant time," Dr. Khan said. "But children don't invent that level of exposure without adult involvement, even indirectly." Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "I'll make sure CPS is looped in immediately. Sophie Grant's on call today." Claire stepped out just then, holding a tray with vials ready for blood draws. "She's calm with the dogs there. We should keep them in the room." Dr. Khan agreed, and they returned. Inside, Claire crouched to Rusty's level, letting him sniff her wrist before she moved near Lila's arm. "Okay, sweetheart. We're going to give your blood a little trip so the lab can read its story. It's quick, and I'll be gentle." Lila flinched at the sight of the needle, but Shadow shifted closer, resting his chin on the table's edge so his eyes were directly in her line of sight. Rusty wriggled forward and set one paw on her thigh. Claire's hand was steady. The needle slid in the vial, filled, and it was over almost before Lila realized she'd only squeezed Shadow's fur, not cried out. "There," Claire said, capping the sample. "You did perfectly." Dr. Khan gave her an approving nod and began noting observations in the chart. "We'll start fluids and schedule imaging. Once Sophie gets here, we'll also talk about next steps for her safety." Ethan took that as his cue to radio in his voice low and clipped. Dispatch confirmed Sophie was en route. Back inside, Lila had slid down a little on the table, both dogs flanking her like sentinels. Rusty had stopped shivering. His eyes were half closed in contentment. Shadow lay stretched paws just touching the toes of Lila's sneakers as if anchoring her in place. Ethan crouched beside them. "You hanging in there?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. "That backpack of yours?" he said lightly. "You keep important things in it." Her gaze flickered toward the wall where it rested, then away. "It's just stuff," she murmured. "Would it be okay if I had a look, just so we can dry things out for Rusty?" She hesitated, then gave a tiny shrug. "I guess." Ethan retrieved the bag, setting it carefully on a chair. The zipper stuck halfway, teeth warped from years of use. Inside was a tangle of a small towel, a cracked plastic toy horse, and beneath that, 4 small metal canisters, dull with age, their caps rusted. Faded hazard labels peeled at the edges, the triangular warning symbols barely visible. The solvent scent was stronger here, rising faintly even through the cold metal. Ethan's mind jumped immediately to an incident a year earlier, a warehouse fire at the edge of Cedar Hollow, leftover paint drums, industrial solvents. Shadow had been there too, sniffing the rubble. The smell was the same. He slid the towel back over the canisters and zipped the bag without comment, but his eyes met Shadow's. The dog's ears flicked forward, recognizing the connection. Sophie Grant arrived within minutes, the brisk tap of her boots heralding her before she stepped into the room. Mid-30s with a coat still flecked from the rain outside, she greeted Lila with a smile that didn't demand a response. "Hi, Lila. My name's Sophie. I work with kids to make sure they're safe. I hear Rusty and Shadow have been taking good care of you." Rusty lifted his head at his name, earning a small stroke from Lila's fingers. Sophie gave Ethan a quick glance, reading something in his expression. Can we talk outside?" In the hallway, Ethan briefed her injuries. Chemical rash, the canisters, the solvent smell. Sophie's brow furrowed deeper with each point. And Dr. Khan thinks it's chronic exposure. Likely, Ethan confirmed. Whatever this is, she's been around it for a while. Sophie exhaled, already planning. "We'll need to coordinate with law enforcement for a home check." "Can you get a warrant moving? I'll start the paperwork now," Ethan said. They stepped back in together, presenting a unified calm. Lila looked from one to the other, sensing the shift in purpose, even if she didn't understand it. Shadow read it too, rising to his feet tail, giving a slow sweep. Dr. Khan entered again, holding a printed order for imaging. "We're ready for the ultrasound," she said. "We'll take it slow." Rusty was settled into Lila's lap and Shadow walked beside the gurney as they rolled her toward the imaging suite, his amber eyes sweeping the hallway as if every shadow might need guarding against. Ethan followed the backpack in his hand, the weight of the canisters pulling at more than just his arm. The ultrasound room was kept dim, lit only by a soft blue glow from the machine's monitor. Lila lay on her side knees, drawn up slightly, while Dr. Khan moved the transducer in slow, practiced arcs over the thin layer of gel on her abdomen. Rusty rested on the padded table near her hip, his head tucked against her arm. Shadow had positioned himself at the foot of the bed, body lengthwise along the rail, his gaze shifting between the doctor's hands and Lila's face. Sophie Grant stood near the corner, her notebook closed for now. She knew when a child's trust was too fragile to survive the scrape of a pen on paper. Lila had hardly spoken since Sophie's arrival. But the way the girl held Rusty and occasionally reached her toes toward the warmth of Shadow's side told Sophie more than words might. "All right," Dr. Khan murmured, adjusting the probe. "Almost done." "You're doing wonderfully, Lila." Lila's eyes flicked toward Ethan, who stood just beyond the doctor's shoulder. He offered her the faintest smile. "Told you she was good at listening to bellies?" The machine gave a final soft beep, and Dr. Khan stepped back. "We'll have the images reviewed soon, but nothing immediately life-threatening," she said quietly to Sophie and Ethan. "Her liver enzymes will tell us more once the blood works back." Sophie nodded, the clinical part of her mind, filing it away. But another part was already turning over the fact's bruises in varying stages of healing a rash, consistent with chemical exposure and the smell of solvents embedded in the fabric of the child's belongings. By mid-morning, the rain had shifted from steady to intermittent, leaving the streets slick and smelling faintly of wet cedar. Sophie decided it was time to visit the girls' neighborhood before Victor Parker could anticipate an official approach. Sometimes the lay of a street and the voices of neighbors filled in what paperwork couldn't. Ethan offered to drive. Shadow climbed into the rear of the SUV without hesitation, and Rusty, temporarily entrusted to Sophie, sat in the carrier she placed beside Lila's seat. The girl's hands never left the mesh panel, her fingers curling through it as if she could tether Rusty's heartbeat to her own. The houses on Lila's street wore the weary look of a neighborhood that had been left out of most town improvement plans. Paint flaked from siding lawns, had grown wild or been reduced to patchy mud, and the occasional rusted car sat under tarps that had lost their fight with the wind. Victor Parker's house sat near the end of the block, a squat, single-story duplex with faded olive siding and a porch light that even in daylight flickered with the fitful pulse of an old wire. Sophie didn't stop there. Not yet. Instead, she scanned the opposite side of the street until her gaze caught on a figure pruning a row of potted geraniums under a narrow awning. Martha Ellison had the kind of presence that could be felt before she turned her head tall. Despite her aged shoulders still straight, her thick hair a crown of silver curls. She looked up at the sound of tires on wet asphalt, and when she saw Sophie step out, her expression shifted into polite reserve. "Miss Ellison?" Sophie asked, voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the patter of a fresh sprinkle. "That's me." Martha replied, setting down her shears. You're not selling anything, are you? I've already got more gutter cleaning flyers than I need. Sophie smiled faintly. No, ma'am. My name's Sophie Grant, Child Protective Services. I'm looking into the welfare of a little girl on this street, Lila Parker. At that, Martha's eyes sharpened. She took in Sophie's coat, the ID badge clipped to her belt, then glanced toward the SUV where Ethan stood beside the driver's door. Shadow's head was visible in the rear window, ears pricked. Is she all right? She's safe for now, Sophie said. At the hospital, she hesitated a moment, gauging the woman's openness. We're trying to understand more about her situation. I was hoping you might know the family. Martha's mouth pressed into a thin line. I've known that child since she could walk. Sweet as spring honey, always smiling. That changed about a year ago. What happened a year ago? Sophie prompted gently. Martha wiped her hands on the hem of her cardigan, eyes narrowing as if sifting through memories. Her mama disappeared. Hannah, lovely young woman, polite. Kept a tidy garden right where those weeds are now. She and Victor Martha stopped sighing through her nose. They weren't the perfect couple, but she adored Lila. Then one night, loud voices louder than usual, spilled out into the yard. I heard Victor shouting something about not letting her ruin everything. A door slammed, a car tore off, and Hannah never came back. Sophie noted the phrasing. No goodbye, no contact, not that I've seen. I asked Victor where she'd gone. He said she left them, like she'd just walked away. But it didn't sit right with me. People don't pack up and vanish without a trace when they've got a little girl like Lila. The rain thickened again, drumming lightly on the awning. Ethan approached his boots silent on the wet pavement until he reached them. Ma'am, he greeted with a respectful nod. Ethan Ward, Cedar Hollow PD. Martha's gaze softened at his introduction, perhaps reassured by the combination of uniform and the watchful shepherd in his vehicle. Sophie asked, Do you know what Victor does for work? He's a painter, Martha said without hesitation. Houses, sometimes commercial jobs. I've seen him come home with his clothes smelling like turpentine and worse. And lately, before the weather turned, there were evenings when I'd see him unloading metal canisters from his truck. Not the kind you buy at the hardware store. Bigger. Looked like they belonged in an industrial yard. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophie, his jaw tightening. Ever see Lila near them? Martha's lips pursed. More than once. She'd be outside sitting on the porch steps, rolling one of those little paint tins between her hands like it was a toy. I told her to be careful. She just shrugged, said her dad. Let her help sometimes. Help with what Sophie pressed. She didn't say, Martha replied. And before I could ask more, Victor came out and told her to get inside. Shut the door behind them. Ethan made a mental note to check disposal records from local paint suppliers. If Victor was bringing home hazardous material, it might tie directly to the chemical patterns Dr. Kahn had observed. Martha seemed to read the direction of their thoughts. Look, I don't like to speak ill, but that house hasn't felt right since Hannah left. Lila's smile went with her. You didn't hear laughter from that porch anymore, just the sound of the TV through the walls, and sometimes silence so heavy it made me close my curtains. The image lingered in Sophie's mind, a small house holding its breath. Thank you, Ms. Ellison, Sophie said sincerely. This helps us understand what might be happening. We'll do everything we can to keep Lila safe. Martha nodded, her expression equal parts worry and relief. Tell her I said hello. And that Rusty's getting big. Hannah told me she was thinking about a second dog before she left. Maybe that little one was meant to be. Back in the SUV, Sophie relayed the conversation to Ethan while Lila listened from the back seat. At the mention of her mother's name, the girl's shoulders tensed beneath the blanket draped over her. Rusty pressed his head against her chest, and Shadow shifted closer, resting his chin on the edge of her knee. Lila Sophie said softly, turning in her seat. Miss Ellison remembers your mom. She said she was kind. Lila's eyes stayed fixed on the puppy's ears. She's gone, she murmured. Do you know where Sophie asked? A pause, then a small shake of the head. Daddy says she didn't want us anymore. Ethan felt that twist in his chest, the kind that came when truth and a child's belief collided. He glanced at Sophie, silently agreeing to let it rest for now. Pressing too soon would only drive Lila deeper into silence. Instead, he said, Rusty looks like he could use a snack. What do you think? Partner Lila's mouth twitched, almost a smile, and she nodded. They returned to the hospital by early afternoon, rain still streaking the windows in uneven rivulets. Dr. Khan met them in the hallway with preliminary results. Liver enzymes are elevated, she told Sophie quietly, consistent with long-term exposure to solvents. We're starting her on supportive care immediately. I'll document everything for your report. Sophie thanked her, already mentally connecting the data points, Martha's account of the canisters, Victor's occupation, the pattern of injuries, and now the medical evidence. It was enough to justify a home inspection, and with a judge's approval, an emergency removal if needed. Before Sophie left the room to make those calls, she watched Lila settle back against the pillows, Rusty curled like a comma at her side. Shadow stretched along the floor with his paws brushing the hem of the blanket. The girl's eyes had closed, her breathing evening out. For the first time since Sophie had seen her, she looked like she might be resting without fear. By the time the judge's signature dried on the paper, the rain had stopped, leaving Cedar Hollow wrapped in a damp, heavy stillness. The air smelled of moss and asphalt. Ethan folded the warrant and slid it into the breast pocket of his jacket, then glanced toward the back of the SUV. Shadow sat alert behind the divider, amber coat catching what little light filtered through the clouds, and beside him, Rusty shifted restlessly in his carrier. Both dogs seemed to know they were heading somewhere that would demand more than routine patrol work. Victor Parker's street was quieter than it had been that morning. The sky hung low gunmetal gray, and the duplex at the far end looked as though it had been drained of color years ago. Ethan parked at the curb a house away, letting the engine tick down into silence. He stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the rain-softened earth, and rounded to open the rear door. Shadow jumped out, landing without a sound, and stood scanning the yard ahead. Ethan lifted Rusty from the carrier, tucking the puppy under his arm until they reached the porch. Sophie wasn't here. She was still at the hospital, with Lila ensuring the girl wouldn't wake to an empty room. That left Ethan to handle the entry alone with his two partners. He knocked once firmly. A shuffle of feet inside, then the door cracked open. Victor Parker filled the frame. Tall, lean hair, a tangle of brown and gray eyes, dulled but sharp enough to register the paper in Ethan's hand. "What's this search warrant?" Ethan said, voice even. "We'll be taking a look around." Victor's jaw worked as if chewing on a reply he knew wouldn't change anything. After a moment, he stepped aside, muttering, "Suit yourself." Inside, the air was warmer, but thick, the chemical tang unmistakable. Not just paint, it had that sharp, bitter edge of solvents that linger in the sinuses. Shadow's nostrils flared, his body tightening with focus. Rusty wriggled in Ethan's arm, emitting a low whine. The living room was cluttered, paint-streaked tarps bunched in a corner, an open toolbox spilling screwdrivers, and a half-empty coffee cup perched on top, and walls mottled with patchy primer. The muted television washed the space in a flicker of pale blue. Ethan started down the hallway, Shadow pacing ahead with the precision of a search pattern. Rusty's head turned toward each doorway they passed, his ears flattening slightly at the smell that grew stronger. Lila's bedroom was the third door on the left. Ethan paused at the threshold. The room was smaller than he expected, narrow bed against the wall. Pale yellow comforter rumpled, but neatly tucked at the foot, a bookshelf crowded with worn fairy tale paperbacks and faded drawings taped to the closet door. Shadow stepped inside, first nose low. He moved toward the bed, paused, then turned to the closet. Ethan opened it to find a row of clothes hanging limply, a jumble of shoes at the bottom. Shadow sniffed along the floorboards, then suddenly froze, ears pricking toward the bed again. Ethan knelt and lifted the dust ruffle. Beneath the frame sat a gallon paint can, half covered by a towel streaked with dried green and red. The smell hit immediately, dense chemical, almost metallic. He pulled the can out with gloved hands. The label identified it as industrial-grade solvent-based coating, the kind never meant for indoor use. "This yours?" Ethan asked over his shoulder. Victor leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "She plays with my stuff sometimes. It's just a can." "This isn't regular paint," Ethan said. "It's industrial. Unsafe for children." "I never told her to touch it," Victor replied, tone hardening. "She's always into things." Ethan set the can aside and made a note in his log. Rusty let out a short bark, pulling Ethan's attention to the open window above the bed. The sill was smudged with faint streaks of the same colors on the towel, as if small hands had gripped it after handling the can. Shadow's attention shifted toward the back of the house. Ethan followed him through the kitchen past a counter stacked with paintbrushes left to dry and a row of jars filled with murky liquid. The back door opened onto a patchy yard, ringed by half-dug holes and stacks of cinder blocks. Shadow led them toward the porch steps, pausing to sniff at the latticework underneath. He began pawing at one-corner claws, scraping wood. Rusty, now on the ground, trotted forward and sniffed at the same spot. His tail stiffened, and he let out another bark, sharper this time. Ethan crouched and shone his flashlight beneath the porch. A scrap of faded blue canvas peeked from the dirt, the corner ripped and frayed. He reached under and dragged it out. The bag was heavy, and when he unzipped it, the contents clinked, more metal canisters, each with rusted caps and faded hazard labels, and a pair of child-sized gloves stained yellow. Victor had followed them outside, his voice tightening. "I don't know where that came from." "You work for North Bend Freight?" Ethan asked, turning the bag so the logo North Bend's was visible on one side. "Sometimes they subcontract," Victor said, eyes sliding away. "You know what this is?" I said, "I don't." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "Your daughter's been sick. These canisters match materials from a warehouse fire last year, North Bend property." "That's not a coincidence." Victor's mouth opened, closed, then settled into a thin line. "That bag's been there a while. Maybe from another job. I didn't tell her to play with it. That's not going to be enough," Ethan said. Back inside, he photographed the paint can from Lila's room, the bag and its contents, and the gloves. Each item went into an evidence bag. The chemical smell clung to his gloves even after he sealed them. Shadow prowled the rest of the house, his nose guiding them through a small laundry room where several rags hung stiff with dried streaks of varnish. In the garage, Ethan found a half-empty drum of the same solvent, its lid askew. As he worked, Ethan couldn't help recalling the warehouse fire, how the blaze had been blamed on faulty wiring, how the investigation fizzled when the owners claimed the damaged materials were all standard stock. But he remembered Shadow lingering in the rubble, fixated on a set of scorched containers with hazard symbols, their contents unaccounted for. Now here they were, buried under Victor Parker's porch. When the sweep was finished, Ethan logged the inventory and secured it in the SUV. Shadow hopped in, settling on his blanket. Rusty climbed into his carrier, but not before giving one last suspicious sniff toward the Parker house. Victor stood on the porch, watching. "You think you've got something? You don't know half the story." Ethan met his gaze. "Maybe not. But I know enough to keep Lila safe." As they drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. The house shrank behind them, but the weight of what they'd found didn't. Rusty was already curling up, eyes drooping, the tension easing from his small body. Shadow lay with his head on his paws, the picture of quiet vigilance. The late afternoon light was fading into that muted gold that barely reached the far corners of Cedar Hollow Community Hospital's pediatric ward. Outside the tall windows, the rain had thinned to a mist that made the parking lot lamps glow with soft halos. Inside room 207, the air was warmer, tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic and the muted hum of an oxygen vent in the corner. Lila sat propped against a stack of pillows, knees drawn up under the thin hospital blanket. Rusty was curled in the hollow between her hip and the bed rail, a warm amber ball of fur breathing in short, even puffs. On the floor, Shadow lay parallel to the bed, his head angled so his amber eyes could follow both the door and the girl's face without moving. He didn't blink much, just watched steady as stone the way only a dog trained to guard without intimidation could. Ethan sat in the chair closest to her, leaning forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees, his voice low enough to feel like it belonged to the small space between them. Sophie stood near the window, arms folded loosely, her posture relaxed, but her eyes attentive. They had been talking about small things at first. Rusty's clumsy chase of a tennis ball earlier, Shadow's stubborn refusal to give up a seat once he claimed it. Nothing important on the surface, but everything important in the way it softened the line of Lila's shoulders. When Ethan shifted the conversation, he did it carefully, like someone setting a fragile object on a shelf. "Lila," he said earlier, when I asked about the backpack, you said it was just stuff. But you know, some things aren't just stuff. Sometimes they tell a story. If you feel like telling me, I'm here to listen." Lila's gaze dropped to Rusty, her fingers smoothing a patch of fur behind his tiny ear. The puppy adjusted his head and sighed, leaning harder into her touch. Shadow let out a slow breath of his own, a soundless reassurance. "It was for the project," she murmured, after a long moment. Ethan kept his expression open. "The project?" She nodded, eyes still on Rusty. "Daddy called it our secret project. Just me and him." Sophie's attention sharpened without changing her stance. "What kind of project was it?" Ethan asked gently. Lila's voice thinned the words, careful. "We had little cans like soda cans, but metal all over, and we poured paint in them. Different colors? Sometimes the smelly stuff, too." She wrinkled her nose. "It made my head feel funny." "Smelly stuff," Ethan prompted softly. "It wasn't paint. It was in big buckets with danger signs, triangle ones. I wasn't supposed to spill it because it cost more. Daddy said I was good at filling them, just enough. Then he'd put the tops on and line them up." Ethan kept his breathing even. "Where did you do this?" She hesitated, then lifted her eyes to his. "In the place with the big, shiny drums. Taller than me. Some had sticky stuff on the sides, and the floor was cold. Sometimes I played with Rusty there while Daddy worked. Sometimes I helped. He said it was our job together, so we'd always have a home." Sophie moved closer to the bed, her voice quiet but steady. "Lila, when you say shiny drums, do you mean metal barrels?" The girl nodded quickly. "Silver with lids. Some had words on them. Daddy told me not to read them out loud." Ethan leaned forward a fraction more. "Did you ever go there without your dad?" She bit her lip. "One time he left me there while he went to make deliveries. He said it was just for a little bit, but it got dark inside. I stayed near the lunchbox." "The lunchbox?" Sophie asked. "It had princess stickers," Lila said. "I kept crackers in it. But it started to smell like the cans, and I didn't want to throw up on it, so I left it there." Shadow shifted, resting his chin on the mattress, so his muzzle was inches from her elbow. Rusty stirred, sensing the change in her voice, and stretched so that his head rested against her ribs. Ethan spoke again, quieter now. "When you were at the place with the shiny drums, did you ever see anyone else?" "Sometimes other men," she said. "They didn't talk to me much. Daddy told me to stay in the corner with Rusty." Sophie knelt so her eyes were level with Lila's. "You've done a very brave thing telling us this. What you've described will help us understand why you've been feeling sick. And it's not your fault." "Do you understand that?" Lila's eyes flickered toward her, uncertainty shadowing them. "Daddy said if I told anyone, they'd take me away, and I'd never see him again. No one is going to hurt you here." Sophie said, her tone gentle but anchored in certainty. "You're safe in this room. With Ethan, with Shadow and Rusty, and with me." For a moment, the only sounds were the soft whir of the vent and the faint patter of mist against the window. Ethan reached for the notepad he'd set on the side table, scribbling a few lines while keeping his voice calm. "Leila, do you remember what the smelly stuff looked like? The ones in the buckets with the triangles?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Yellow stuff on the gloves when we were done, sometimes red on the floor. The buckets had scratches on them like they'd been outside before." He met Sophie's gaze. They didn't need to say it out loud. Her description matched the evidence under Victor's porch and the hazardous labeling from North Bend Freight's fire site. Shadow moved his head just enough to nudge Lila's arm, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. The girl's hand found the curve of his neck without looking, fingers curling into the warmth of his fur. Rusty gave a small whine, pushing closer until his tiny nose was against her palm. "Do you want to stop for now?" Ethan asked. Lila shook her head slowly. "I can tell a little more." She went on to describe how Victor would sometimes come home with the canisters already in the truck bed, and she'd help carry them to the shed behind the house. She talked about the rag pile in the kitchen, how the colors never washed out completely, and how some nights she'd wake up with her throat burning. "When that happened, did you tell him?" Sophie asked. "Yes," Lila said. "He said I was being a baby. Then he'd open the window and tell me to sleep it off." Ethan's grip on his pen tightened for a second before he forced it to relax. He made a small note about the open window, possible ventilation to reduce fumes, but it did nothing to erase the harm. They let the conversation taper into lighter ground after that. Ethan told her about the first time Shadow had tried to ride in the front seat and refused to move until bribed with half a sandwich. Sophie asked what color Rusty's collar should be if they bought him a new one. Lila chose green because it's like grass when it's happy. By the time Dr. Khan came in to check her vitals, Lila's eyelids were heavy. The puppy had already surrendered to sleep, his body limp against her. Shadow stayed where he was, the quiet guardian, his eyes soft but awake. Sophie stepped into the hallway with Ethan while Dr. Khan worked. "That's enough to connect Victor to direct exposure," Sophie said. "And if we tie the site she described to North Bend Freight's records, we can prove she was left at a hazardous location," Ethan finished. "The lunchbox could still be there. If it hasn't been moved, we'll have residue evidence." "I'll get a team on it," Sophie said. "But for now, she needs to rest. You saw how she checked for both dogs before she answered anything serious. They're the reason she could talk at all." Ethan glanced back into the room where Lila's fingers twitched once in her sleep against Shadow's fur. "Then they're staying, when Doctor." Khan emerged a few minutes later. She confirmed what Ethan and Sophie already knew in their bones. "Her body's been processing low-level toxins for some time," she said. "We're addressing the acute symptoms, but the only cure is eliminating the exposure completely. Whatever environment she was in, it has to be off-limits to her from now on." "It will be," Sophie said. Ethan added, "We'll make sure of it." They both knew that meant more than just paperwork. It meant cutting the chain at its source, even if that chain led straight into the records of a freight company with a history of burying its own mistakes. For tonight, though, their job was simpler. Keep the girls safe. Keep the dogs close. And keep the door closed against anything that smelled of solvent's fear or the lie that she was safer in silence. Shadow stretched and settled into a deeper watch at the foot of the bed. Rusty snuffled in his sleep, one tiny paw pressed against Lila's ribs. And in the low lamplight, the girl's breathing steadied into the rhythm of someone who, for the first time in too long, could fall asleep knowing that the next voice she heard would be kind. The low hum of the hospital corridor was broken by the sudden slam of the double doors. Ethan looked up from the nurse's station, his instincts tensing before his eyes even registered who had entered. Victor Parker strode forward, his heavy boots echoing off the linoleum, his presence casting a shadow that seemed to pull the warmth out of the air. His jaw was tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides, and his eyes darted from door to door until they locked onto the one with Lila's name outside. In room 213, Lila was sitting upright, a soft blanket tucked around her thin frame. Rusty was curled at her feet, his amber eyes half closed while shadow lay stretched across the narrow space between the bed and the door, his body forming an unspoken barrier. The faint beeping of the heart monitor kept a steady rhythm, one that Lila had begun to trust over the last few days. The door swung open before anyone could warn her. Victor's broad figure filled the frame. Lila's breath caught and her fingers instinctively reached for Rusty, pulling him close. Her wide eyes shimmered with fear, her body shrinking back against the pillows. Shadow was on his feet instantly, the fur along his spine bristling as he stepped forward, placing himself between Victor and the bed. His low, steady growl was more a promise than a threat, his gaze locked on the man now standing inside the room. Ethan was already moving down the hall, Sophie close behind. He reached the doorway, just as Victor took a step closer to Lila. "Stop right there!" Ethan's voice was firm, carrying the authority of someone who had faced far worse than intimidation. Victor's glare shifted from the girl to Ethan. "She's my daughter," he said sharply, his voice edged with something between anger and defensiveness. "I have a right to see her." Sophie stepped in beside Ethan, her posture calm but unyielding. "Mr. Parker, you were informed this visit was not approved. Lila is under protective observation, and you have been asked to stay away until the investigation is complete." Victor's expression hardened. "Protective observation. You're keeping her from me. She's here because she needs care," Ethan replied, his tone steady, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "And right now, that means keeping her safe from anything or anyone that could cause her more harm." Rusty let out a soft whine, pressing his head into Lila's side. She held onto him, her knuckles white from the strength of her grip. Her voice didn't rise above a whisper, but Sophie heard it. "I don't want him here." That was enough. Sophie stepped fully into the doorway, her hand resting gently against the doorframe as she blocked Victor's view. "You need to leave, Mr. Parker. Now." For a moment, Victor didn't move his gaze, flicking between the protective stance of the two dogs, Ethan's unwavering eyes, and the small figure of his daughter behind them. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned toward the hall. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low, but carrying enough weight to echo in the tense silence. Ethan followed him to the elevator, making sure he left the ward entirely. Only when the doors slid shut did Ethan let his shoulders relax. He walked back to the room where Shadow had already returned to Lila's bedside. The big German shepherd sat close enough for her to rest her hand on his warm fur, his calm presence anchoring her in the moment. Rusty nestled against her hip, his smaller body a steady heartbeat under her palm. Dr. Aisha Khan entered quietly a few minutes later, her hands holding a clipboard, but her eyes fixed gently on Lila. "I've reviewed the latest tests," she said softly, taking a seat beside the bed. "Lila, your liver has been hurt from being around those chemicals for so long. It's going to take time, but we can help you heal." Lila's gaze flicked to Ethan, then Sophie, then back to Dr. Khan. Will it go away?" she asked, her voice tentative. "With care, good food, and rest, we can make it much better," Dr. Khan assured her. "And you have a lot of people here, and 2 very good dogs, making sure you get exactly that." Shadow shifted closer, his head lowering until his chin rested lightly on the edge of the mattress. Lila's small hand reached out, finding the familiar softness of his fur. Rusty pressed against her other side as if sealing her in a circle of quiet protection. Ethan watched the way her breathing eased, the way her shoulders loosened in their presence. In that moment, it was clear those two dogs weren't just companions. They were the walls of her fortress, the guardians who would stand between her and any storm. Outside, the late afternoon light spilled through the window, casting a warm glow across the bed. Inside, the air still carried the weight of what had just happened, but it also held something stronger resolve. Whatever Victor Parker's next move would be, Ethan knew one thing: Lila would not face it alone. Ethan sat at his desk in the small, dimly lit office at the Cedar Hollow police station, the muted hum of the overhead fluorescent light casting a pale circle over the scattered folders and photographs. Outside, the late afternoon sky pressed low against the town, heavy with the scent of rain. Shadow lay sprawled beside his chair, her warm golden-brown coat shimmering in the faint light ears, flicking at every distant sound from the hallway. Across the room, Rusty rested quietly in his bed, head nestled between his paws. The slow rhythm of his breathing, a calming presence in the tense air. The file in front of Ethan was thicker than he had expected. Official notices, inspection forms, and enforcement warnings from the State Department of Environmental Safety were neatly stamped and dated. Each document painted a picture that was far from innocent. Victor Parker had been cautioned multiple times about unsafe storage of industrial chemicals, including solvents and paint compounds that could easily cause harm if mishandled. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying Lila's quiet voice from the hospital room, the way her small fingers had curled in Shadow's fur as if afraid to let go. Those documents weren't just proof of negligence. They were threads leading to a much larger tapestry. The sound of quick footsteps approached. Sophie Grant appeared in the doorway, a slim folder clutched to her chest, her cheeks still flushed from the brisk walk over from the CPS office. Her expression was tight, but there was a glint in her eyes that hinted at something important. "I just got off a call." She began stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. "Ethan, Lila's mother is alive." Ethan straightened his chair, creaking under the shift of his weight. "Alive? You're sure?" Sophie nodded, opening her folder to reveal a printed report and several notes scrawled in her tidy handwriting. "Her name's Hannah Parker. Well, Hannah Caldwell now. She's living in a small town in Montana. She's been there for about a year. I spoke with a local caseworker who confirmed she once tried to file for custody, but the paperwork never went anywhere. She claimed Victor blocked her attempts to contact Lila." Ethan's jaw tightened. That explains the gap why no one from her mother's side has been in the picture. But why Montana? And why did she leave without her daughter? Sophie exhaled, lowering herself into the chair opposite his desk. The caseworker said Hannah left after a huge fight with Victor. Neighbors reported yelling and threats. Apparently, she didn't have the financial means or the legal standing to take Lila with her at the time. She's been trying to rebuild her life since, but she's kept an address and phone number registered with the county clerk's office, maybe hoping someone would find her. Shadow shifted, sensing the heavier tone in Sophie's voice, and moved to rest her head gently on Sophie's knee. Sophie reached down absent-mindedly to stroke her fur. Ethan looked back at the documents spread before him. If Victor was warned about chemical storage before, and if Lila's been around those toxins for this long, Hannah might have no idea how bad it's gotten. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to talk to her. If she's willing, she might confirm patterns of behavior we can use in court, neglect, endangerment, even obstruction of contact." Rain began to tap against the station's windows, soft at first, then growing steadier, filling the silence that hung between them. Ethan imagined the small hospital room where Lila lay guarded by the constant watchful presence of Shadow and Rusty. Every piece of information mattered, because the more they knew, the closer they got to ensuring she never had to return to that dangerous environment. Let's arrange a call, Ethan said finally. If Hannah's willing to talk, I want her account on record as soon as possible. Sophie nodded, gathering her notes. I'll make it happen. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. Ethan? Lila trusts you. She doesn't say much, but you can see it. Whatever happens next, she's watching you to see if you'll keep your word. Ethan gave a slow nod. Then I'll make sure we don't let her down. When Sophie left, Ethan remained seated for a long moment, the muted patter of rain wrapping the room in a cocoon of thought. He reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ear. The German shepherd tilted her head slightly, amber eyes meeting his with quiet certainty. Rusty lifted his head, as if in agreement, his tail giving a slow thump against the floor. The puzzle pieces were starting to take shape. Victor's history with hazardous chemicals, Lila's unexplained injuries and symptoms, the disappearance of her mother, and now confirmation that Hannah was out there and perhaps still fighting in her own way. Ethan knew the road ahead would be tangled. Victor wouldn't give up easily, especially if the investigation began circling closer to his other connections like North Bend Freight and that warehouse fire. But with every new fact, every voice willing to speak the truth was becoming harder to bury. Outside, the rain kept falling over Cedar Hollow, washing the streets in silver and carrying the scent of wet earth through the open office window. And somewhere far to the northwest, in a quiet Montana town, a woman named Hannah Parker might be waiting for the call that could change everything for her and for the little girl she hadn't seen in far too long. The highway stretched endlessly under a slate-gray sky, the windshield streaked with the light drizzle that had begun just as Ethan left Cedar Hollow. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat of the SUV, amber eyes scanning the road, Edge's ears twitching at every distant sound. Rusty remained behind at the hospital, curled in a blanket on Lila's lap as she rested, the two dogs forming her fragile shield, while Ethan was gone. The miles rolled beneath them in a steady rhythm. Ethan's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, but his mind was far ahead, tracking the path of a small girl, a father's negligence, and a mother who had vanished from sight. He glanced at Shadow. The big dog's head was cocked slightly, nostrils flaring at the faint scent of lingering chemical residue clinging to Ethan's jacket. Shadow had been trained for search and rescue, for detecting the scent of danger and distress. But this trip was different. There was no disaster site, no missing hiker in the mountains. Here, Shadow's instincts were tuned to the human heart, to the tension in the air that spoke of fear and longing. Ethan let him be that way. The dog alert without panic, a silent companion to the miles ahead. Hours passed. The landscape changed from the familiar cedar-lined streets of Cedar Hollow to open fields streaked with the gold of late afternoon sunlight, breaking through clouds to the rolling hills that hinted at Montana's quiet wilderness. Ethan stayed focused, occasionally sipping coffee, occasionally checking the GPS, always keeping Shadow in view. The dog's amber eyes never left the horizon, never left the road, never left the mission they were on. At last they turned off the main highway onto a narrow road, flanked by small businesses and homes set back from the street. A little bakery with a faded sign hung over the front door, the scent of fresh bread faintly drifting in the air even from the road. Behind it, a small house sat tucked among flowering shrubs and a modest picket fence, the kind of home that suggested care, quiet, and safety. Ethan parked discreetly at the edge of the driveway and took a deep breath. He held the file with Hannah Parker's records in one hand and checked his phone for the notes Sophie had compiled. Shadow's ears twitched and the dog leaned slightly forward, sensing the shift in purpose. Ethan walked to the front door, rapped lightly, and stepped back. He could hear footsteps inside, quick, deliberate, cautious. The door opened a crack, and a woman appeared. She was slender, her hair pulled back loosely, a scarf draped around her neck. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of him, registering the badge clipped to his belt and the serious expression he wore. "Miss Parker," Ethan asked gently. Yes, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. And you are? My name is Ethan Ward. I'm with Cedar Hollow Police Department. He stopped himself, careful not to overwhelm her. I'm here about your daughter, Lila. For a moment, her eyes flicked past him, scanning the SUV, as if expecting a trick, a threat. Then she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. Ethan followed Shadow close behind, moving with the calm dignity that only a trained German shepherd could. The inside of the house was modest but cozy. Books lined shelves against the walls. A small table was set for tea, and in the corner hung a quilt with bright patches that suggested care and memory stitched into fabric. Hannah led him to a chair by the window. She gestured for him to sit. Shadow positioned himself so he could see both Ethan and the door. "I've been waiting," she said finally, her hands twisting a scarf nervously. "Waiting to hear something about her, about my little girl." Ethan took a deep breath. She's safe for now. And she's been telling us some of what's happened. He paused, gauging her reaction. We need to know everything you can tell us about the circumstances that led you to leave Cedar Hollow. Hannah drew in a shaky breath. It wasn't voluntary. Victor, he threatened me. Said that if I tried to take her with me, if I tried to reach out, there would be consequences. For me, for Lila. He made sure that everyone I could have contacted would turn me away. Ethan nodded slowly, letting her speak, letting her own words carry the weight. Shadow shifted slightly, the amber eyes softening tail, brushing against the floor in a silent sign of support. Rusty wasn't here physically, but Ethan imagined the small warmth of that presence waiting back in the hospital room, bridging the gap between mother and daughter. I had no choice. Hannah continued. I left with nothing but what I could carry. Every day I thought about her. Every night I kept the scarf she had left behind, the one she used to wrap herself up when she was cold. It smells like her still. I've kept it with me all this time. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his jacket pocket. Would you mind showing me? Hannah reached under her arm and produced a small faded scarf. The fabric was soft, worn thin at the edges, patterned with tiny stars. She held it out to him. The scent was faint but unmistakable childhood warmth. A trace of detergent and a memory of Lila pressed close. It's beautiful, Ethan said softly, handing it back gently. You kept her close in every sense. That's important, and it tells me everything about how much you care. Tears pricked Hannah's eyes, and she blinked quickly. I never stopped thinking about her. Never. Not a day. I couldn't come back. I couldn't risk her being hurt more. You did what you thought you had to do to protect her, Ethan said. Now we're going to make sure she's safe and that she can come home to you without that fear hanging over her. Shadow shifted his weight, pressing slightly closer to Ethan's chair, as if acknowledging the unspoken promise. The big dog's steady presence seemed to lend courage to the woman before him, reminding her that fear could be met with protection. Hannah leaned back slightly, breathing more evenly, though her hand still clutched the scarf. I just want to see her, to hold her, to make sure she knows she's loved, she whispered. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. We're going to make that happen. And you're not alone this time. Shadow and Rusty are part of her world now, and they'll help make the transition safe and calm. Hannah's eyes glistened as she reached for the scarf again, pressing it to her cheek. She deserves to feel safe, she said softly. And I can finally help make that real. Ethan leaned back, letting the moment settle. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the small yard, and inside the warmth of the home, the careful presence of two dogs, one large one imagined in memory, created a space where trust could begin to rebuild. For the first time in nearly a year, the path forward seemed clear. Reconnect. Mother and daughter protect the child from harm and unravel the chain of fear and negligence that had kept them apart. And in that small Montana house, amidst the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door, Hannah Parker held Lila's scarf close and allowed herself to hope. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft scrape of papers and the low murmur of the bailiff moving about. Sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, casting long, solemn beams across the polished wooden floor. Lila sat on the edge of the witness bench, Rusty perched safely in her lap, his tiny paws brushing against her legs, and Shadow stationed beside her chair, alert. Amber eyes flicking toward the entrance. Judge Raymond Ellis presided over the session, a tall man with graying hair and a calm, measured demeanor. He looked down at the documents before him, then up at the room, letting the quiet settle before speaking. "Court is now in session," he said, voice steady, carrying the authority of years on the bench. "We are here to determine the temporary custodial arrangements for Lila Parker, Ms. Grant, you may present your case." Sophie Grant stepped forward, her posture composed but purposeful. She carried a thick folder, neatly organized, containing photographs from the hospital statements from Ethan Ward and the official documents from North Bend Freight's hazardous material records. "Your Honor," she began, "what we have here is evidence of sustained endangerment and neglect affecting Lila Parker, submitted with the aim of establishing her immediate safety." She gestured toward the projection screen behind her. Images from the hospital filled the display, photographs of Lila's bruises, her rash medical charts detailing the liver enzyme elevations, and annotated notes from Dr. Aisha Khan's examinations. Rusty's ears twitched at the soft click of the projector, while Shadow's gaze remained fixed, a silent pillar of reassurance. "These injuries are not accidental," Sophie continued. "They correspond with long-term exposure to industrial chemicals stored in her home environment. Witnesses and medical professionals have confirmed the pattern and the probable cause. Additionally, we have testimony from Hannah Parker, Lila's mother, who has been prevented from maintaining contact due to threats and obstruction from Victor Parker, the child's father." Sophie handed the folder to the clerk. "Your Honor, this collection establishes both the immediate risk to Lila and the credible claim that her mother is capable and willing to provide a safe, nurturing environment. We request that temporary custody be granted to Ms. Parker while the investigation continues." Judge Ellis nodded and looked down at the documents, then back up at Sophie. "Is the father present to respond to these allegations?" Sophie shook her head. "No, Your Honor. He has been duly notified but is absent today." The judge exhaled slowly, fingers steepled. "Very well. I have reviewed the materials presented, and in the absence of the father, the court finds sufficient evidence to justify temporary custodial placement with the mother, Hannah Parker. This decision is to ensure the immediate safety and well-being of the child." A soft gasp ran through the gallery. Lila's hand tightened around Rusty, who whined softly, sensing the tension. Shadow nudged Lila's side lightly, a subtle reminder that she was protected, that the moment was hers to process safely. Judge Ellis continued, "This temporary custody order will remain in effect until the next hearing. All parties are to comply fully with the court's instructions. The child shall be allowed to see her mother immediately, under supervision, with no interference from the absent parent." Sophie gave Ethan a subtle nod. It was time. Ethan rose, carefully lifting Rusty from Lila's lap and placing him on the floor so she could move freely. Shadow followed, stepping protectively beside her as she stood clutching the blanket that had comforted her through the proceedings. "Mom's waiting," Ethan whispered softly. Lila's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and anticipation flickering across her face. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Hannah Parker stepped forward. She was dressed simply, but there was a quiet strength in the way she moved, a mix of relief and restraint. Her eyes found Lila immediately, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Lila's legs trembled, but Shadow and Rusty were there, anchoring her to the moment. Lila took a cautious step forward, then another. Rusty nestled against her side, Shadow at her heels. Hannah knelt, opening her arms, but waited as Lila inched closer. When they finally embraced, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Rusty nuzzled against Lila's tail, wagging softly, and Shadow rested his head against her knees, the three dogs forming a living circle of protection around the reunited mother and daughter. "You're safe now," Hannah whispered, holding Lila tightly. "I've missed you every single day." "I missed you too," Lila said, voice small but clear. She rested her cheek against her mother's chest, Rusty snuggling closer to reassure her. And Shadow exhaled in a deep, steady sound, signaling that the danger had passed, at least for the moment. Ethan stepped back, allowing the reunion to unfold, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the courtroom. The father's absence made the logistics simpler, but Ethan knew this was only the beginning. There would be further investigation, questions about North Bend freight, and legal follow-ups, but for now, Lila was safe in the arms of her mother, surrounded by those who had protected her in every way possible. Sophie took a seat beside Ethan, watching the interaction. "She's going to remember this day for the rest of her life," she said softly. Ethan nodded, and we made sure it was one where she felt safe, even in the middle of fear. The judge tapped his gavel gently. Court adjourned. Outside sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time that morning, casting warm beams into the courtroom. For Lila, Hannah, and the protective pair of dogs at her side, it felt like a new beginning, a moment of peace after a year of uncertainty, and the first step toward a life reclaimed from neglect and danger. Shadow shifted, resting his chin on Lila's knee, while Rusty nudged her hand, a gentle reminder that she was never alone. The bond between them, the child and the dog's mother and daughter, was now unbreakable, witnessed by the court, sealed by protection, and strengthened by love. And for the first time in over a year, Lila allowed herself to breathe, knowing that safety at last was not just a promise, it was real. The early morning sun painted the streets of Cedar Hollow with a soft golden hue, reflecting off the freshly washed sidewalks and glinting on the windows of small shops and houses. The town seemed calm, deceptively peaceful, as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened in its quiet neighborhoods. But Ethan knew better. North Bend Freight had finally faced the consequences of its negligence. After weeks of investigation, federal inspectors had determined that the chemical storage at the company's warehouse had violated multiple safety regulations. The resulting legal action forced North Bend to pay restitution for damages, close the warehouse indefinitely, and remove unsafe materials from the community. Several executives and managers had been dismissed, held accountable for the chain of harm that had affected not just Lila, but other unsuspecting families over the years. Ethan drove slowly through the familiar streets, Shadow perched in the passenger seat, ears alert and amber eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Rusty was back with him, sitting comfortably on the folded blanket in the rear seat, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the passing air. The two dogs had become indispensable companions on every trip, whether to the hospital, the park, or Lila's home. Their presence was more than protective. It was restorative. Today they were headed to Lila's house, a small, well-kept home not far from her school and the art studio of Angela Morse. Lila had adjusted quickly to life with her mother, Hannah. But the visits from Ethan, Shadow, and Rusty were always a highlight, moments of playful warmth amid her structured routines. The front yard was bursting with early spring blooms, a contrast to the muted, chemical-stained world she had left behind. Hannah opened the door before Ethan could knock, a bright smile on her face, and waved them in. "Come on in. Lila's been working on something special today." Lila appeared from the living room doorway, Rusty trailing behind her, and Shadow entering, like a guardian prince, paused silent on the hardwood floor. The girl's eyes lit up as she spotted Ethan, and she held out a piece of paper with a flourish. "It's for you," she said, a shy grin spreading across her face. Her small fingers trembled slightly with excitement as she handed over the drawing. Ethan took it gently, careful not to crease the paper. The drawing was a riot of colors, vibrant and joyful. In the center, Shadow stood tall, a majestic amber coat gleaming under a sun that seemed to have sprung straight from Lila's imagination. Rusty appeared at his side, tiny and eager tail wagging, his eyes bright. Ethan recognized himself in the corner, sketched with a gentle smile and a hand reaching toward the dogs. Above it all, in bubbly letters, Lila had written, "Our heroes." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Shadow nudged his hand with his nose, and Rusty gave a tiny bark of approval, as if he understood the gravity of the gesture. Lila's cheeks flushed pink, a mix of pride and nervousness. "You did this?" Ethan asked softly. "I wanted to," she admitted. Because you keep me safe. And Shadow. And Rusty, too. You're all my heroes." Hannah watched the exchange, her eyes glistening. "You've been through so much, Lila. But look at what you're giving back, your art, your heart. This is your power now." Ethan set the drawing carefully on the table, kneeling to give Lila a hug. Shadow leaned in, resting his head gently against her shoulder, while Rusty wriggled closer to nestle between them. It was a tableau of protection, love, and loyalty that transcended the dark months they had endured. "Let's hang this up," Hannah said, reaching for a small frame from the shelf. "It deserves a place of honor." Lila helped, giggling as she positioned the drawing near the window where sunlight would illuminate it all day. After a moment, Ethan stood and stretched. "How about a walk?" he suggested. "Shadow and Rusty could use some fresh air, and I think a little adventure is in order." Lila's eyes widened. "Can we go to the park, the one with the flowers?" "Of course," Ethan replied, smiling. Shadow barked once, tail wagging as if to confirm the plan, and Rusty bounced in excitement, tiny paws pattering against the floor. Outside, the air was crisp and sweet with the scent of spring. Lila ran ahead, Rusty chasing her small feet, while Shadow trotted beside Ethan with that steady vigilance that always made him feel safe. The park was alive with colored tulips and daffodils swaying in a gentle breeze, children laughing in the distance. Lila stopped to pick a dandelion, Rusty nosing at her heel, and Shadow lay down nearby watching over them. Ethan watched her carefully. The legal battles were far from over. The federal investigation would continue, and Victor Parker's absence from custody proceedings didn't mean the fight was finished. But for now, in this moment, justice had been served in a tangible way. Lila was alive, protected, and surrounded by those who loved her. They spent the afternoon painting, running, and laughing. Lila held Rusty close as Shadow nudged her with his nose, encouraging her to throw a stick for him. Every bark, every wag of a tail, every careful glance from Ethan reminded her that she was no longer alone, no longer a silent witness to fear. At the end of the day, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed pink and orange, Lila held up her latest painting, a scene of a sunlit meadow with Shadow and Rusty standing guard at her side. Ethan nearby, and her mother watching lovingly. "They're our heroes," she whispered, echoing the words she had written earlier. Ethan smiled, kneeling beside her. "Yes, Lila. And you are our hero too." Shadow lay down beside her feet, Rusty curling in her lap, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet of Cedar Hollow felt like peace rather than fear. Justice had been done. Protection had been restored, and love had reclaimed what had been nearly lost. The town of Cedar Hollow had transformed overnight. What had been damp, muted streets under the gray spring drizzle were now alive with color and light. The annual spring festival had taken over the park near the school and art studio tents lined in cheerful stripes, ribbons fluttering in the soft breeze and the scent of freshly baked bread and caramelized apples drifting from the food stalls. Laughter and music mingled with the song of birds returning from their seasonal migrations, a chorus that felt like a promise. Lila Parker ran barefoot across the dew-kissed grass, each step sending cool droplets flying, her laughter ringing like the clear chime of tiny bells. Rusty bounded after her, chasing her small shadow with an uncoordinated burst of energy, yipping joyfully. Shadow, older and steady, lay beneath a sprawling oak, his amber eyes tracking her every movement, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest almost matching the beat of her laughter. Hannah Parker stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her, watching her daughter with a mixture of awe-relief and quiet gratitude. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away immediately. She didn't need to. The scene before her, her daughter alive, free, and laughing without fear, was worth more than any restraint or formality. "Be careful," Hannah called gently, though her voice carried no fear, only warmth. Lila slowed just long enough to turn and grin, cheeks flushed with exhilaration. Rusty leapt in excitement, bounding around her legs, the small German Shepherd pup's energy a perfect complement to Lila's own. Shadow's gaze softened as he watched the two, alert but relaxed, the guardian of her newfound joy. Lila bent down to scoop Rusty up, pressing the tiny pup to her chest, giggling at his soft yips. The festival around them continued. Unabated children running with painted faces, artisans displaying handcrafted jewelry, and the smell of flowers from nearby stalls mingling with the earthy scent of fresh grass. For Lila, the entire world had become a playground, unburdened by the shadow of fear that had once followed her home. Hannah walked across the grass, her shoes tucked under her arm as she approached Lila. The mother's heart thumped as she reached her daughter, careful not to disturb the magic of the moment. "You're growing so strong," Hannah said softly, voice trembling just enough to betray the depth of her emotions. Lila leaned into her mother's embrace for a moment, Rusty snuggling between them, and then dashed forward again, bare feet sliding across the soft ground. Shadow shifted slightly beneath the oak, lifting his head to watch, ears alert, then settling back down, confident that his little charges were safe. Nearby, a group of children waved from a kite-flying area, bright colors rising into the sky, their strings taut in the wind. Lila ran toward the kite's, eyes wide with delight, Rusty trotting after her. She reached the field's edge and threw her arms up in laughter, the sound carrying across the festival grounds. Hannah stayed behind for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath. The pain of the past year, the worry, the separation, the fear was still there, but it had begun to dissolve under the weight of this simple joy. She could see that her daughter's spirit had not only survived, it had flourished. Shadow's amber gaze, steady and unwavering, reminded her that protection had been constant, even in the darkest moments, and Rusty's joyful antics confirmed that hope had not just returned, it had grown. Ethan Ward stood on the periphery of the festival, leaning against a fence post, watching the scene unfold. Shadow stayed at his side, ears swiveling at each burst of laughter, tail swishing lazily. Ethan couldn't help but smile, the tension of the past weeks beginning to lift. The legal battles were still in motion, but in this field of green, surrounded by the music, the scents, and the laughter, he felt the kind of quiet victory that didn't need a gavel or a courtroom. It was visible in Lila's bare feet on the grass, in Rusty's energetic leaps, and in Shadow's calm vigilance. Lila darted back toward her mother, clutching a freshly picked bouquet of daisies she had gathered from the festival's flower stall. She handed it to Hannah, who accepted it with shaking hands. "For you?" Lila said, her voice bright, unguarded. "For being my mom." Hannah knelt, pressing her forehead to Lila's small, flushed face. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered. "I promise I'll never let you go." Nearby, Shadow rose slowly and padded to the edge of the oak, tail held high, surveying the field with a calm authority. Rusty followed Lila's steps, leaping and spinning as she ran toward the carousel, their movement a living embodiment of freedom reclaimed. The festival's music swelled, a gentle orchestration of flutes and strings that seemed to underscore the moment with a quiet triumph. Children's laughter blended with the songs, the smell of spring flowers heavy in the air, and the sun breaking through the clouds warmed the earth beneath them. Ethan watched it all, shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. This was the proof that safety, care, and love could rebuild a life almost lost. Shadow's ears flicked at a distant sound, alert but calm, and Rusty barked once, chasing an invisible butterfly, a small reminder that joy could be both playful and protective. Lila ran past Hannah again, spinning in a circle, the soft fabric of her dress catching the sunlight. She reached Shadow, patting his head affectionately, and Rusty tumbled into her arms once more, yipping with delight. Hannah's eyes glistened, and she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. The dangers, the neglect, the absence, all of it had been met with action, love, and vigilance. And here in this field of green and sunlight, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and two devoted companions, the bonds of protection and love were visible, tangible, unbroken. For Lila Parker, for Hannah Parker, and for the two loyal dogs at her side, the festival was more than celebration. It was a symbol. The power of love. The importance of guardianship and the enduring hope for every child had never been more clear. As the afternoon light stretched across the field, Lila ran again, Rusty chasing her shadow, observing from beneath the oak the world alive with possibility. And for the first time in a long while, Cedar Hollow felt like a place where safety and joy could coexist, a place where the silent ones had finally been heard.